All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to tonight's strategic update for Monday, June 27th. And I'm joined by Michael Steger. Tonight's discussion is coming at a time where there is a total transformation that's going on right now. Victory for life, victory for destroying this cult of death and evil is emerging. And I think the title for tonight's discussion is an appropriate one. Death Cult Throws a Tantrum. Let's build a renaissance of creative life. And that is what Lyndon LaRouche Pact has been dedicated to for its entire existence. The idea of destroying this oligarchical British-run death cult that has now been challenged by what just happened with the Supreme Court ruling against Roe v. Wade, and to declare that in the interest of every human life and in the interest of the lives of babies. But this goes deeper than this, because right now what you're seeing, as many people are seeing this all over the television, as a result of that, this goes back to the policies that have dominated our nation for the last 50 years, the destructive policies since the 1960s with the drug, sex, rock and roll counterculture, the destructive policies that brought in Paul Ehrlich, the policies of population control, and also the policies that came about with the initiation of the abortion policies in 1973. And all of these things have been at the center of the idea that human beings are worthless and that we have to instigate a culture of death. And that's what we're continuing to see in our society. But not only is the Supreme Court ruling actually causing a shift in terms of the thinking, but it's going to take a cultural transformation as well. And you see this from the standpoint of the response that you're getting to these rulings. I think it's important to look at the fact that you have total chaos and total destruction that's going on right now, where individuals are risking the lives of others because they don't like the rulings that have taken place. I'll give you a couple of examples that I'm sure most of you have seen here, and we'll talk about what this means and how we fight back against this. For example, you have in Seattle, there was a major protest that took place around pro-abortion people, and a few anti-abortion people that were rallying in opposition were there. And one in Seattle, one young pro-life lady was attacked viciously, and she was pepper sprayed by this Antifa mob. And we know how this mob works. You had an announcement that Rudy Giuliani, for example, was attacked coming out of a men's restroom at a grocery store in Staten Island. And this is somebody, he had nothing to do with the Supreme Court ruling, but saying, because you're pro-life, then I have the right to attack you. And of course, there was the New York Catholic Church that had been vandalized with a slogan from extreme abortion people, pro-abortion group Jane's Revenge, that says, with a slogan that said, "If abortion isn't safe, neither are you." I don't know what you call this, but this is the death culture that has been fully at play, especially in the recent period since the presidency of President Trump and what he has represented, and the American people, the MAGA movement, the grassroots movement that says that we're not going to have this any longer. We're not going to have the targeting of our children. We're not going to have the targeting of our livelihoods, of our churches. And at the same time that this is going on, I'll tell you that Biden, the biggest criminal in the White House right now, is facing total resentment from the population, and victory is winning right now in terms of the fight of the people for our constitutional rights. As we speak, Michael will get into this in just a moment here. I will note that the G7 is going on with Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and United Kingdom and United States. And at the same time, Biden is over there while the United States is burning and being destroyed by these lunatics, and by his insane policies is the laughing stock, because he just, according to real clear politics, has the lowest polling average ever now. It's at a 39.1% approval and 56.4% disapproval. So the solution we have laid out, we need a total cultural transformation. We need to ensure family life and structure, and from the standpoint of making sure that every family has the potential to grow and to be creative, for the children to grow successfully. And so therefore, with that, I think that gives you a jumping point to start off to, why our fight in terms of the cultural fight that we've been waging, and the economic battle to return to the true American system principles, which our nation was founded on, a true cultural renaissance and revolution, a third economic revolution is so extremely important right now, with the critical disaster that we're facing in the society, and to take power back, that the American people, we the people, have to take control of our future once again. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael for further dialogue and comment.
Thanks, Keisha. All right, so got a number of people gathered tonight. It's Monday, June 27th. And, I think we all can, if we take a step back and we look at what's taken place over the last couple of weeks with a number of Supreme Court decisions, and certainly the one with Roe v. Wade, that there's a kind of shift taking place in the country, that the tendencies, and you see this, you can see it even, you see the worst of the hypocrisy in Biden's most recent speech at the G7, where he pledged to basically help the world build a new health system and develop new internet cables, and we're going to bring peace and development to the whole world. That's my mission. And that's been the liberal facade. We're here to help. We're going to help develop. We're going to improve things. And while they may have some people that believe that, who worked for them at some point, at this point, the people that are running this neoliberal show are just pure power-hungry creeps. They're sycophants who have just been kind of, intestinal sniffing throughout their entire high school and academic careers to get the jobs in Washington or in law firms. And so you've got no substance behind any of these promises or pledges to do good. All you have is these pledges, and yet you have the exact opposite happening. And the epitome of this was certainly Obama. And that it really, in some ways, is evil itself. To promise such conceptions, and yet to do the most extreme opposite. That's where we've seen the great atrocities occur. That's why, LaRouche PAC put a Hitler mustache on Obama, why Lyndon LaRouche insisted on it. He insisted on it to the point where even some of our own members were just, that because Lynn was willing to make a commitment on the principle that either we reject this current insanity or we will not survive. And the recent decisions by the Supreme Court are worthy of acknowledgement and praise because they made these decisions, and that include the inability, in the case of Maine, to discriminate against a religious school because it was by its nature religious, in this case Christian. They made a decision today, the right for a coach to pray on the football field after the game. No coercion, no mandatory participation, but he personally was going to pray, and was fired for that basis. Certainly the Roe v. Wade decision, we've discussed it before, the right to carry a gun in New York and not with all these extreme restrictions, probably set up to prevent, immigrants in the 19th century from having too many guns. Even if you go back to Machiavelli's Prince, which is really an extraordinary work, it's not what they attempt to make it. It's a call to rescue his nation and to pull his nation together, to pull Italy together, to pull the states of Venice, of Milan, of Florence, of Rome, and of Napoli into a nation of Italy. This is in the early 1500s. Italy doesn't become a nation for over 350 more years. Machiavelli saw the moment to strike. And in some ways, that's pertinent to today. We are at a moment to strike. But even in that work, over 500 years ago, Machiavelli says, never disarm the population. It will only cause them to distrust and hate you because you have no trust in them. So there was a Second Amendment decision. But the Roe v. Wade, and we've discussed it before, there's oftentimes justices will go back and make arguments, as Alito does in the opinion in favor of overturning Roe v. Wade, going back to English common law precedents, common cultural and legal standards, and so on. But the authors of Roe v. Wade go back to Roman Persian law. They even have the gall to denounce the Pythagoreans for believing that life begins at conception. It was a complete rejection, not just of Christian law, but of the course of our civilization and the basis of advanced human thought, culture, music. The existence of modern science exists today because of conceptions of the Pythagoreans and Plato's Academy. They were the very premise, and their conceptions, like the Hippocratic Oath, were the very bedrock of our civilization. And what this court attempted to do in the early 1970s was to overturn that cultural civilization, to undermine the basis for our society to develop. It was this outlook, this intention, that Lyndon LaRouche uniquely recognized and was willing to fight against. So we take great pride and joy in knowing that the efforts of everyone on this call, everyone who's no longer with us, that participated in these fights, has helped to create a bulwark that allowed incoming generations, and some people who might have been a little bit apathetic or unaware, to become cognizant of the kinds of changes that are now occurring and how important they are. They are not yet sufficient, and maybe they perhaps never are, but we still have some substantial changes to make. But there is a specific change. Now, this change happened because of President Trump. Had this not have happened, Hillary Clinton would have had 3 nominations to the Supreme Court. And including John Roberts, that would have been an overwhelmingly neoliberal fascist court with 7 out of 9 justices ultimately in favor of a corporatist neoliberal, really what is a death cult. So this is a shift, and these justices took these decisions, as many of you know, under the threat of possible death. There was the young man, somewhat obviously mentally unwell, who traveled all the way from California just to attack Justice Kavanaugh. There was security, so he was prevented. Completely bizarre how some of these things are worked. And so the question is, are they deployed in some way? We know some of them are, certainly. But you had the Kavanaugh hearing alone was a kind of vox populi. There was a threat. There's a group, Jane's Revenge, as Keisha referenced. there was a threat of violence. This same tactic was used during the Obama administration. They initiated race riots to basically hold back any political opposition. This is, if you look back at the Roman era, this is how political factions in Rome would control the power in the city. They would unleash violent gangs of people that would literally go around committing random acts of violence, and in some cases targeting also political opponents, but merely to create the intimidation and fear of the environment. And yet in that light, the justices have made very important decisions. Now, and certainly it was President Trump's intervention that made this possible. I mean, in some cases, you have to say Mitch McConnell did the right thing in not allowing Merrick Garland. People remember Merrick Garland was nominated, I think, at the beginning of 2016 or end of 2015, when Justice Scalia died suddenly. And Mitch McConnell said, we're not going to have any hearings. But Trump then was able to nominate Gorsuch, just as a quick review, then Kavanaugh when Kennedy retired, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who herself identified that the argumentation to find the right to privacy, to allow all of these kind of cultural decisions to be made, and really just a broader argument that the opinion of R.V. Wade in 1973 made, she herself found it somewhat abysmal and just not legally competent. She died in September of 2020, right before the election. So Trump got his third justice, and certainly John Roberts is typical of the very problem we continue to deal with within the Supreme Court, was that he is a corporatist to the end. He looks at the interests of the corporations before he looks at the interests of the nation itself. And in some sense, that's the kind of change we have to continue to move. You know, the Supreme Court, by its nature, is a structure that looks to reward oligarchical interests. It's basically the appointees are in general determined by the legal community, by lawyers, by small sets of lawyers within elite societies and elite law firms, and then ushered into the president's desk as short lists and so on. And what controls all of that are the corporations that pay these legal fees to these huge law firms for these huge cases. And so the nature of it is to represent that interest. And in some cases, the bigger shift of this, besides the important cultural implications, is that the Supreme Court was turned into a legislative body, and that our political culture has been operating from the standpoint of legislating through the courts rather than legislating through Congress and state legislatures. And so, the Congress has basically neglected any legislative responsibilities because they just pass these huge budget bills. And then the executive will make executive orders, which then are sued or not sued in the courts. We saw this throughout the period. Trump won most of his because his were actually consistent. Biden is losing many of his. Obama was reckless with this. But you can see in a couple of cases, and I'll point to those, how we are looking at a kind of shift into our government's structure is beginning to function. And it's functioning because of the movement that we've been fighting for and that President Trump instigated. That's why this is happening. Because there was a defense of civilization, of the 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 years of development, most unrecorded, some of it then written and recorded, but a course of development that has been defended. And that at the same time, we've now sparked a real movement. And President Trump deserves a lot of credit for doing that. Now, there's a couple of cases where you see we've got to get back. And what the justices have forced the issue on is that there is no basis for these cultural mores these cultural issues to be constitutional or legal issues. They're legislative. If you want to pass legislation that bans certain things or says some things are legal, that's fine, if it's within the power of Congress to be able to deal with, or a state legislature. You can pass legislation. Of course, it can go to the courts, it can be sued if it violates the Constitution in some way, but the Congress has the right to do that. But for the Supreme Court to make those decisions was just a complete fallacy. It was meant to be part of an oligarchical coup. And as we noted in the email tonight, some of you may or may not have read it, but that's what was taking place in the 1960s. That's what the assassinations of the Kennedys, of King, of X, and others were a part of. That's what the Vietnam War was meant to do. It was not a war to kill a bunch of Vietnamese and destroy Vietnam. They had no problem with that. You know, Henry Kissinger and McNamara had no concerns or qualms over that, but they lied to the American people over the Gulf of Tonkin. They drove us into a war after they assassinated Kennedy. When I say they, I mean this global oligarchical structure, mostly centered in London. Today we see extensions of it, and there are always extensions, but the Vietnam War, where did the drugs come into these elite schools? Where all of a sudden marijuana and joints are just all over every major elite university in the country. Where did that come from? Did drug cartels from Mexico drive up to Columbia and Harvard and drop off the boxes of joints? And in some cases, LSD was maybe manufactured there, but it was a program. It was an initiated program, as we know in many ways. There was also massive financial deregulation. Massive financial deregulation, including what Nixon did in '71. But it was also a massive unwinding of the restrictions on the massive speculative activity that now dominates our entire society. And as in some cases, the real squeeze of all of this is that there's a massive economic crisis and the Federal Reserve has no ability to solve it. They're completely stuck. There were, just as a note of that, indices show that there were improved housing purchases, improved other purchases in May, that the economy is doing well and that prices are going up. And so stocks went down. So people are active in buying and engaging in commerce, and the stocks went down because that means that the Fed and Powell, the head of it, will now raise interest rates. And that means that they're going to have less cheap money and no bailouts. So the entire speculative bubble is hinged on cheap money, overturning the debt, and bailouts. It has no relationship. It's actually inversely proportional to actual economic activity. So the choice is very clear. And again, this is really indicative of the choice we have to make as a society and political culture that's similar to the decisions the Supreme Court had to make. So unbeknownst maybe to members of the Supreme Court, and some of them are certainly representative of this, maybe the more aristocratic culture, the legal, finance, and big corporation community. But the decisions they're making are in large part due to how severe and insane the cultural trend has become. The similar changes have to be made. And in some ways, this gets at the power of the presidency to act on the economic questions and to restrict the president from acting unconstitutionally otherwise, that there are real powers of the presidency. But let's look at Congress. Congress has rejected one of its most important, really both of its most important responsibilities. There are two aspects to Congress. One is funding, or is the general economic condition of the country, which has been reduced today to the budget. But they do know hearings. I mean, they may have hearings, but there's not as if their legislative hearings or discussions or committee hearings are focused on how is the country doing? How is our agricultural process going? Where do we need to make changes? How do we open up for more economic activity? It's mostly around a question of lobbying premised that all Congress is meant to do is pass some massive budget of huge amounts of money with no regard to the questions of debt at all or income of the country. And so because they're able to pass these constant budget bills, which they never evaluate, nobody reads, and they don't even change them. The budget bill from last year gets rolled into this year, and they just add a few new things, which then get baked into next year's bill. So of course, lobbyists are going to be all over that because there's no evaluation of what we're doing. You're just taking from the past, so you can bake it into this year. It'll be baked in for the next decade based on the way they're operating, which is just insane. We've got to get back to constitutional responsibilities of our country. And in some sense, that's got to be vectored. To do that cannot be just to end or to be upset or critical of the institutions. We can certainly see the cynicism of these degenerate, populi out in, making threats and bombing pro-pregnancy centers. I mean, it's just like, you really see it's kind of like the Weather Underground, just violence for the sake of violence. The other responsibility, of course, is the question of war. But Congress has rejected that responsibility. It doesn't pass acts of war. It passes authorization to use military force, which have broad implications and have been used in the most gross and absurd ways. So we've got to vector this, but this is the kind of movement that's taking place. These are the kinds of questions we've got to get back to. We've got to turn this ship around. And you're starting to see that the legacy and effect of what Trump did, and it's not so much what he did just with the Supreme Court nominees, it's that he's continued to fight. And that's what we've got to continue to do. We've got to educate this movement on these broader responsibilities. On the question of the executive, one of the most obnoxious and extreme violations is what happened under the Bush-Obama administrations, or we could say more Cheney and Obama administrations. That under an idea by the crown jurist of the Nazi administration of Germany, Carl Schmitt, a notion called the unitary executive was put forward. This ultimately turned Hitler on the executive into a kind of emperor of sorts, emperor de jure. And in doing so, it gave what Cheney and Obama, how they applied it was to judge, jury, and executioner. That we now have the right to determine when we go to war, how we go to war, and who we kill. And we can pick those people out even by individual basis, let alone by groups, and decide that we want to create a kind of condition of murder by fiat, by executive order. And this has spread then, of course, into this massive, corrupt federal bureaucracy that ran the coup against President Trump, that is surveilling the American people, that has punished people like Julian Assange or Snowden. These are the gross violations of our constitutional system. And you're not simply going to turn these things around. You can't force Congress to do that by going to the courts. You can't ultimately change how the executive branch operates, including how the executive branch currently, and people might have seen it, are intending to kind of take over and federalize the upcoming elections as much as they can by going to the courts alone. Because these people are operating not by law, but by a more sociopathic condition of what crimes can we get away with, not what laws do we have to follow. And so these are major changes that also have to occur that have been part of, and especially part of the post 9/11, which is really ultimately, again, part of a coup, a fascist coup run in the United States. That's what we have to overturn today. Now, really, the discussion we've been having, and we'll continue to have tonight, is how do we complete the what's the word to maybe say it? To reestablish our constitutional system, which was violated with that oligarchical coup in the 1960s, with the massive deregulation of our financial system and an explicit policy implemented by the Federal Reserve, as well as hacks in various forms of government, into a deindustrialization policy. We covered that a few weeks ago regarding New York. But this started in an accelerated way in 1960. It was coincided directly with this oligarchical coup. And you've left these cities as massive wounds. Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, massive wounds of cultural despair, murder, and insanity. So, and then also what we saw take place in 2001 with 9/11, where that oligarchical coup was now turned into an outright fascist state. And President Trump has catalyzed a movement to fight that. What we're discussing here is not simply that that's the case, right? This is the implicit context, but it's worth stating tonight, given the decisions by the Supreme Court, to elaborate the context in a certain visceral way, to say that what we're looking to accomplish with the candidates running for state office, state assembly, federal office, Congress, and or school boards and city councils, but people that are taking and volunteering their political responsibility. And we've got to continue to encourage and mobilize people around the kinds of potential shifts we're moving into, regardless if they think it's their purview per se. You know, how does a national bank affect my campaign as for a legislative assembly? Well, it does, because you're a citizen taking responsibility for the country, not just your state or your district. But the question of an economic direction, the question of the powers of our Constitution and of our executive branch to establish things like a national bank, to direct that credit into clear interests of the welfare of our nation, are part of the war and the war powers given to our government to defend us against this globalist oligarchical system. And if those powers are not enumerated, if they're not living in the minds of the citizens who will benefit from them, then the people that have been backing this corporatist takeover will never allow it. It's a movement that makes these powers, and then of course then the principles to which we apply it, possible. It's in the minds of it's within the individual human mind that makes possible these powers, these constitutional powers of development, not from a liberal PR campaign that they try to sell you a car that's going to kill you, a car with no engine and covered in anthrax or something, as like a great free, great deal. The liberal program, right? This is the greatest car you're ever going to drive. We're going to do so much with it. We're going to save so many lives and so on. It stands out that there's more abortion clinics and more abortions in poor Black and Hispanic neighborhoods than there are in the affluent white neighborhoods that support and fund Planned Parenthood. And also are of the houses where these children who are out protesting today and demanding their rights to abortion come from. It was targeted. Margaret Sanger, this whole policy, as we know, was a severe depopulation program. With the question of population growth, and this is where Lyndon LaRouche made a remarkable advancement in economic science. It may seem obvious, but any breakthrough is an obvious breakthrough once it's made. The problem is, until it's made, everybody operates off of a very either some severe or less severe misconception. That real population growth, yes, we need more families. Elon Musk has addressed this. We need more. We've aborted 63 million people. If we had added 60 million people to our population, that would be wonderful. We'd be a stronger, more vibrant country today. But a question of population growth is ultimately a question, it is what Lyndon LaRouche identified as an economic metric. The potential to grow your population. And within that metric, that metric is based on a function. What he called, and this is where it seems technical, potential relative population density. Potential because it's not just how dense your population is or how much people you have per your nation, but it's how much can you sustain. When you gut your cities of industry, when you lose all manufacturing and industrial production, when you fill them with drugs, ideological brainwashing called education, what happens to your potential population or your potential to grow? It drops. So you're measuring not just what is the population, but the ability to grow it. And the relative aspect, why I called it potential relative, is because the powers of the human mind have an ability to fundamentally change our environment, our natural environment. That's what cities are. That's what power plants are. Power plants, even a water wheel, which was the basis of power in the earlier colonial periods where we built up our iron forges and so on. We were acting upon our environment, and we've done so increasingly with greater and greater power until we start going to solar panels and windmills, and then we go backwards. The same is true with canal systems, the Erie Canal, Ohio River systems. The same is true with transportation systems, airline flights, and travel to the moon. We change and act upon our environment. So the land area density, irrigation for crops, fertilizer capabilities, pesticides, the ability to grow, increasing yields, using genetics to increase yield production. This is mankind acting in ways that are not fixed or objective. And that's what every other economist you'll ever study, except maybe a few, and you probably haven't even looked at them because they're just not circulated, Friedrich List or Henry Carey. They've all rejected this ability of the human mind to transform the environment. And that ultimately is the question we have to instigate today and then sustain. This is ultimately the responsibility of, or the purview of government. It's the purview of the entire nation, corporations, individuals, and government, but that's what is our nation. And if the government's not concerned with this, then what is? And the question of culture, which to a large extent is what the Supreme Court has addressed today, and that no longer are we going to legislate through the Supreme Court, and no longer are we going to concoct anti-Christian, anti-science outlook about human life from 9 justices on the Supreme Court. We're going to let that be decided by legislative activity and be determined by the development of our culture. So we're at a certain point of shift. We're growing stronger as a movement globally, as the people are in Russia from Putin's defense, as the people are in nations around the world because of the fight President Trump waged against this globalist terror. And in some sense, what we've got to continue to recognize is we want to develop the culture now that can reform a constitutional government and provide President Trump the kinds of profound constitutional powers our presidency has. He is not limited to Wall Street and the Federal Reserve. He has executive powers within the presidency to act, to establish, and joined with Congress, credit if necessary, reorganization of our banking system, and a focus on the productivity of our population because it is the only viable way we survive. But this is the true defense of creative life. Yes, we recognize life at conception, at least many of us do, as the Pythagoreans did 3,000 years ago. But there's also a conception of why that life is so important, because it has the ability to be creative, to act upon the physical universe, to change its environment. And in doing so, it actually enhances the ability for our nation, for our planet, and for our universe to sustain more human life, more creative ideas, and more development. And that's what's so exciting about the current shift, and certainly the dialogue we have on a weekly basis, including the classes on Saturday. So that's kind of my perspective and thoughts. We've got a lot of people jumping in, excited to discuss tonight, Keisha. So why don't we, I'll throw it back to you and we'll see what people are thinking.